Hello, my name is Nathan Smith. I'm 28 years old. I work as a carpenter in a small town outside Denver, and I thought I knew what loneliness felt like until the day I met Helen Cruz in the hallway of the Riverside Community Center. That was 3 months ago, and tonight, as I stand in this same hallway trying to leave, her fingers catch my belt loop and she whispers, "Not so fast." The words send electricity through my entire body, and I realize this moment has been building since that very first day we met. But let me back up. Let me tell you how we got here, because the story matters. Every detail matters when you're talking about the kind of connection that changes everything. It was a Tuesday in early September when I first walked into the Riverside Community Center. I had been living alone for almost 2 years since my divorce from Sarah, and my sister Frances had been after me for months to get out of the house, meet people, do something besides work, and watch television. She had signed me up for a woodworking class without asking, claiming it would be good for me to teach others what I already knew. I was annoyed at first, but Frances has a way of being right about things even when you don't want her to be. The community center smelled like heavy and old books with hints of sawdust from the workshop rooms. I was carrying my toolbox and a folder of project plans when I turned the corner into the main hallway and nearly collided with a woman coming out of the pottery studio. She was covered in clay dust, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, and when she looked up at me with these incredible brown eyes, I forgot how to speak for a moment. She smiled and said, "Sorry, I wasn't watching where I was going." I'm always in my own world after pottery class. I managed to say, "No problem at all. I'm Nathan. I think I'm lost." She laughed, a warm sound that made something tight in my chest loosen. "Helen," she said, "where are you trying to go?" "Woodworking class," I said, feeling suddenly self-conscious about the whole thing. "Oh, you must be the new instructor Frances told me about. I'm Helen Cruz. I teach the pottery classes here on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Trust me, this story is going places you won't expect." That first conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes, but something about Helen stayed with me all through that first woodworking class. Maybe it was the way she had clay under her fingernails but didn't seem embarrassed about it, or how her smile reached her eyes in a way that felt genuine. Most people I meet these days seem to be performing some version of themselves, but Helen felt real. Over the next few weeks, we developed a routine. My woodworking class ended at 8:30, and her pottery class wrapped up around the same time. We would often find ourselves walking to the parking lot together, talking about our students, our projects, sometimes just the weather. These conversations were easy in a way that surprised me. After my marriage ended, I had convinced myself that I was better off alone, that relationships were more trouble than they were worth. But talking to Helen didn't feel like trouble. It felt like breathing. I learned that she had moved to town 6 months earlier to take care of her aging father, leaving behind a successful career as a graphic designer in Chicago. She was 31, had never been married, and was trying to figure out what came next in her life. She spoke about her father with such tenderness, describing how he had been a potter himself before arthritis forced him to stop, and how teaching pottery classes was her way of keeping that connection alive. One evening in late September, as we walked to our cars, Helen stopped suddenly and said, "Nathan, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said. "Do you ever feel like you're just going through the motions, like you're waiting for your real life to start?" The question caught me off guard because it was exactly how I had been feeling for months. I looked at her standing there under the parking lot lights, and I realized I wanted to tell her the truth. "Every day," I said. "Since my divorce, I feel like I'm just marking time." She nodded slowly. "That's exactly it. Marking time." We stood there for a moment, and I felt something shift between us. It was subtle, like the moment when you realize you're no longer strangers with someone. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" I asked, the words coming out before I could second-guess myself. "I'd like that," she said, and her smile was different than before. Warmer, more personal. Our first coffee date was on a Saturday morning at a small cafe downtown called Miller's. Helen arrived wearing a green sweater that brought out the gold flecks in her eyes, and I remember thinking that I wanted to memorize everything about how she looked in that moment. We talked for 3 hours without pause, covering everything from our childhoods to our dreams to our fears about the future. She told me about growing up as the youngest of 4 children in a loud, loving Mexican-American family in Phoenix, and how moving to this quiet Colorado town had been an adjustment. I shared stories about learning carpentry from my grandfather and how working with my hands had always been the thing that made sense to me when nothing else did. What I loved most about talking to Helen was how she listened, really listened, not just waiting for her turn to speak, but taking in what I was saying and responding thoughtfully. When I told her about the furniture pieces I made in my garage workshop, she asked to see pictures, and when I showed them to her on my phone, she studied each one carefully. "These are beautiful, Nathan," she said. "There's something about the grain patterns you choose, the way you let the wood's natural character show through. It reminds me of pottery, actually. You're working with the material instead of against it." No one had ever described my work that way before, and hearing it from Helen made me see my own craft differently. As October arrived, our coffee dates became regular weekend events, and we started spending time together outside the community center. Helen invited me to a local art fair where she was displaying some of her pottery, and I was amazed by the delicate bowls and vases she created. Each piece had its own personality, and I could see her artistic vision in every curve and glaze choice. "You should see my disaster pieces," she said with a laugh when I complimented her work. "For every bowl that turns out like this, there are 3 that end up in the recycling bin." "I doubt that," I said. "Oh, it's true. My father always said that pottery teaches you humility. The clay has its own ideas about what it wants to become." I started looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with an intensity that surprised me. The highlight of my week became those moments when Helen and I would walk out of the community center together, talking about our day or sharing stories from our past. Sometimes we would sit on the bench outside the building and talk until the parking lot was empty except for our 2 cars. One Thursday evening in mid-October, Helen seemed quieter than usual as we walked outside. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the maple trees lining the street had turned brilliant shades of orange and red. "Everything okay?" I asked as we reached the bench. She sat down and was quiet for a moment before saying, "My father had a bad day today. Some days he remembers everything perfectly, and other days he asks me 3 times who I am." I sat beside her, close enough that I could smell her perfume, something light and floral. "I'm sorry, Helen, that must be incredibly difficult." "It is," she said, "but it's also why I'm here. These might be our last good months together, and I don't want to waste them." The vulnerability in her voice made me want to reach for her hand, but I wasn't sure if we were there yet. Instead, I said, "You're not wasting anything. You're being exactly the daughter he needs." She turned to look at me then, and there was something in her expression that made my heart race. "Thank you for saying that, Nathan. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, leaving my life in Chicago." "Did you love your life there?" I asked. "I thought I did," she said. "I had a good job, a nice apartment, friends, but looking back, I think I was just comfortable. There's a difference between being happy and being comfortable." I knew exactly what she meant. My marriage to Sarah had been comfortable too, right up until it wasn't. "What about you?" Helen asked. "Do you miss being married?" I considered the question carefully. "I miss the idea of having a partner," I said, "but I don't miss the relationship I actually had. Sarah and I were like roommates by the end. We were polite to each other, but we had stopped really seeing each other." Helen nodded. "That sounds lonely." "It was," I admitted. "Lonelier than being alone, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," she said. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the evening light fade behind the mountains. Finally, Helen stood up and said, "I should get home to Dad." "Of course," I said, standing as well. As we walked toward our cars, she surprised me by taking my hand. Her fingers were warm and soft, and the simple contact sent warmth spreading through my chest. "Thank you for listening, Nathan," she said. "It means more than you know." "Any time," I said, and I meant it completely. That night, I lay awake thinking about the weight of her hand in mine and the way she had trusted me with something so personal. I was falling for Helen Cruz, and the realization both thrilled and terrified me. The following week, Helen missed both of her pottery classes. I found myself checking the parking lot obsessively, hoping to see her car, but it never appeared. By Thursday, I was worried enough to ask the community center director if she knew anything. Helen's father was hospitalized, she told me. Nothing life-threatening, but he needed some tests done. I spent the weekend thinking about Helen, wondering if she needed anything, wishing I had her phone number. We had somehow never exchanged contact information, meeting only through our coincidental schedules at the community center. When Tuesday arrived and I saw Helen's car in the parking lot, I felt a rush of relief. She was waiting by the pottery studio when I arrived, and she looked tired but smiled when she saw me. "How's your father?" I asked immediately. "Better, thank you. It was just a medication adjustment that threw him off, but it was scary for a few days." "I'm glad he's okay," I said. "I was worried about you." Something in her expression softened. "You were worried about me." "Of course I was," I said. "I realized I don't even have your phone number. If something had happened to you, I would never have known." She pulled out her phone. "Let's fix that right now." Exchanging phone numbers felt like crossing some invisible threshold. That night, Helen texted me a photo of a lopsided bowl she was working on with the message, "Remember what I said about disaster pieces?" I texted back, "That's not a disaster, it has character." Her response came quickly. "You're very kind, Nathan Smith." Over the next few days, we began texting regularly. Good morning messages, photos of projects we were working on, random thoughts throughout the day. Helen had a way of noticing small details and sharing them that made me feel connected to her even when we were apart. She would send me pictures of interesting cloud formations or tell me about something funny one of her pottery students had said. One Saturday morning she texted, "Are you free today? I want to show you something." I was free, and an hour later she picked me up in her small blue Honda. She was wearing jeans and a cream-colored sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked more relaxed than I had seen her in weeks. "Where are we going?" I asked as she drove out of town. "You'll see," she said with a mysterious smile. 20 minutes later, we pulled into the parking area for Riverside Trail, a hiking path that followed the creek through a series of small canyons. I had driven past the trailhead countless times, but had never actually hiked it. "I discovered this place a few weeks after I moved here," Helen said as we started walking. "It's where I come when I need to think." The trail was beautiful, winding through stands of aspen trees that were showing their fall colors. The creek gurgled alongside the path, and the air smelled clean and crisp. Helen walked with an easy confidence, pointing out interesting rock formations and plants she had learned to identify. About a mile in, we came to a small clearing where someone had placed a wooden bench overlooking the water. Helen sat down and patted the space beside her. "This is my thinking spot," she said. "I can see why," I said, settling next to her. The view was peaceful, with the creek flowing over smooth stones and the mountains visible in the distance. "I come here when I'm trying to figure things out," Helen said, "like whether I'm making the right choices or what I want my life to look like." "What kinds of things are you trying to figure out?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "What happens next? With my father, with my career, with everything. I've been in survival mode for so long, just getting through each day. But lately I've been thinking about what I actually want." "What do you think you want?" I asked. She turned to look at me, and there was something vulnerable in her expression. "I think I want to stop being afraid of making the wrong choice and start making choices that feel right." The way she said it made me think she wasn't just talking about career decisions. There was something in her eyes that made my pulse quicken. "What about you, Nathan?" she asked. "What do you want, William?" I looked at her sitting there in the dappled sunlight, and I realized I wanted to be honest about what I was feeling. "I want to stop going through the motions," I said. "I want to feel like I'm actually living instead of just existing." She nodded slowly. "I know exactly what you mean." We sat there for a long time, talking about our dreams and fears, our past relationships and future hopes. Helen told me about her ex-boyfriend in Chicago, a fellow designer who had been supportive but ultimately couldn't understand why she felt compelled to leave everything behind to care for her father. "He said I was throwing my life away," Helen said. "Maybe he was right, but it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the only thing I could do." "You did the right thing," I said. "Family matters." She smiled at me. "You always say exactly what I need to hear." As we walked back to the car, Helen slipped her hand into mine again, and this time it felt natural, like something we had been doing for years. When we reached the parking area, she turned to face me. "Thank you for today, Nathan," she said. "I haven't felt this relaxed in months." "Thank you for sharing your special place with me," I said. She stepped closer, and for a moment I thought she might kiss me. Instead, she reached up and touched my cheek gently. "You're a good man, Nathan Smith," she said softly. The week following our hike, something shifted between Helen and me. Our conversations became more intimate, our text messages more frequent and personal. We started meeting for coffee, not just on weekends, but on weekday mornings before work. I found myself looking forward to seeing her with an intensity that reminded me what it felt like to be genuinely excited about something. One Tuesday evening after our classes, as we walked to the parking lot, Helen stopped suddenly. Nathan, she said, would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? I mean, a real dinner. I could cook for you. I'd love that, I said, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. Good, she said, smiling. 7 o'clock. I'll text you my address. I spent Wednesday afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation. I stopped by the flower shop downtown and bought a small bouquet of sunflowers, remembering that Helen had mentioned they were her favorite. I also picked up a bottle of wine, though I wasn't sure if she drank. Helen's house was a small, craftsman-style home on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees. The front porch had 2 rocking chairs and several pots of herbs, and warm light glowed from the windows. I could smell something delicious cooking as I walked up the front steps. Helen answered the door wearing a blue dress I had never seen before, her hair styled in soft waves around her face. She looked beautiful, and I told her so. Thank you, she said, blushing slightly. Come in. The inside of her house was cozy and welcoming, with exposed brick walls and hardwood floors. Her pottery was displayed throughout the living room, and I could see her father's work as well, pieces that showed the same artistic sensibility, but with the confidence that came from decades of practice. Dad's resting, Helen said, noticing me looking at the pottery. He has good days and bad days, but today was a good one. He's excited to meet you properly sometime. I'd like that, I said, handing her the sunflowers. Her face lit up. Nathan, these are perfect. How did you remember? I pay attention, I said. She led me into the kitchen, where she had been preparing what smelled like chicken with herbs and vegetables. The kitchen was small but efficient, with copper pots hanging from hooks and fresh herbs growing on the windowsill. Can I help with anything? I asked. Just keep me company, she said, stirring something on the stove. Tell me about your day. As I watched Helen cook, moving around the kitchen with easy confidence, I realized how natural this felt. We talked about work, about her father's good day, about a new project I was starting for a client who wanted a custom dining room table. The conversation flowed as easily as it always did, but there was an added layer of intimacy that came from being in her private space. Dinner was delicious, and we lingered at the small table in her dining room, talking and laughing as the candles she had lit burned lower. Helen told me stories about her childhood in Phoenix, about learning to make tamales with her grandmother and helping her father in his pottery studio. He taught me that clay is alive, she said. It responds to your mood, your energy, even the weather. You can't force it to do what you want. You have to work with it. That sounds like good life advice, I said. It is, she said. I'm still learning to apply it to things other than pottery. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where Helen had built a small fire in the fireplace. We sat on her couch close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body next to mine. The wine had relaxed us both, and our conversation became more personal. Can I ask you something? Helen said, turning to face me. Anything, I said. What happened with your marriage? You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but I'm curious. I had been dreading this question, but looking at Helen's open, non-judgmental expression, I found I wanted to tell her. Sarah and I met in college, I said. We dated for 3 years, got married right after graduation. For a while, everything seemed perfect. We had similar goals, similar interests, but somewhere along the way, we stopped growing together and started growing apart. Helen nodded, encouraging me to continue. The thing is, I said, neither of us did anything wrong. We just became different people than we were when we got married. Sarah wanted to travel, to live in a big city, to have adventures. I wanted to build something stable, to put down roots. We tried to compromise, but eventually we realized we were making each other unhappy. That must have been heartbreaking, Helen said softly. It was, I admitted, but it was also a relief when we finally admitted it wasn't working. The last year of our marriage, we were both pretending to be happy. It was exhausting. Helen was quiet for a moment, then said, I think it takes courage to admit when something isn't working. I'm not sure it was courage, I said. More like desperation. She laughed gently. Sometimes those are the same thing. What about you? I asked. Have you ever been close to marriage? Once a while, she said. With David, my ex in Chicago, we talked about it, looked at rings, even discussed timeline. But something always held me back. What was it? I asked. I think I was waiting to feel the way I thought I was supposed to feel, she said. Like I couldn't imagine my life without him. But the truth was, I could imagine it very easily. And when my father got sick and I knew I needed to move here, David's reaction told me everything I needed to know. What did he say? I asked. He said I was choosing my family over our future together. Like it was a competition, Helen said. He couldn't understand that taking care of my father wasn't a sacrifice. It was just what you do for people you love. You're right, I said. It's not a choice at all. She smiled at me. That's exactly what I mean. You understand that. We talked until almost midnight, sharing stories and observations, laughing at each other's jokes, sitting closer and closer together on the couch. When Helen yawned and said she should probably get some sleep, I felt disappointed that the evening was ending. This was wonderful, Helen, I said as she walked me to the door. Thank you for cooking for me. Thank you for the flowers and for the company, she said. I had a really good time. We stood there for a moment, and I could feel the possibility of a kiss hanging in the air between us. But something held me back. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe it was the fear of moving too fast and ruining what we had been building. Instead, I reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. Good night, Helen. Good night, Nathan, she said, squeezing back. I drove home with the windows down, feeling more alive than I had in months. Whatever was happening between Helen and me, it felt right in a way that nothing had for a long time. The next few weeks passed in a blur of increased closeness and deepening connection. Helen and I began spending more time together outside of the community center, taking walks around town, visiting the farmers market on Saturday mornings, sharing quiet dinners at local restaurants. We were building something together slowly and carefully, and I found myself thinking about her constantly. One Saturday in early November, Helen suggested we visit a nearby town that was hosting an arts and crafts festival. The drive took us through mountain passes that were beginning to show the first hints of winter, and Helen was animated as she pointed out landmarks and told me stories about places she had discovered during her solo explorations of the area. The festival was charming, with local artisans displaying everything from hand-woven textiles to carved wooden sculptures. Helen moved through the booths with obvious appreciation for the craftsmanship, asking thoughtful questions of the artists and examining their techniques. At one booth featuring handmade jewelry, she stopped to admire a simple silver bracelet with a small turquoise stone. "That's beautiful," she said to the elderly woman running the booth. "It's one of my favorites," the woman replied. "The turquoise comes from a mine about 50 miles from here. My late husband and I used to collect stones there together." Helen tried on the bracelet, and it looked perfect against her skin. But when she saw the price, she reluctantly took it off and handed it back. "Maybe next time," she said politely. After we left the booth, I made an excuse to go back and buy the bracelet while Helen was looking at pottery at another vendor. I planned to give it to her later, maybe for her birthday or Christmas. We had lunch at a small cafe overlooking a mountain lake, and Helen seemed more relaxed and happy than I had ever seen her. The mountain air had put color in her cheeks, and she laughed easily at my stories about some of the more eccentric clients I had worked for over the years. "This is perfect, Nathan," she said, gesturing at the view and then at me. "This whole day. I feel like myself again, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," I said. "I feel the same way." On the drive home, Helen was quiet, looking out the window at the passing landscape. Finally, she said, "Can I tell you something?" "Of course," I said. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said that night at dinner, about not wanting to just go through the motions anymore," she said. "I think I've been afraid to really live for a long time, always waiting for the right moment, the perfect situation." "What changed?" I asked. "You did," she said simply. "Meeting you made me realize that the right moment is just the moment when you decide to stop waiting." Her words made my heart race, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "What does that mean for you?" "I think it means I need to stop being afraid of what I want," she said. "What do you want, Helen?" I asked. She turned to look at me, and there was something determined in her expression. "I want to be happy. I want to take chances. I want to see what happens when I stop overthinking everything." The rest of the drive passed in comfortable silence, but I could feel something building between us, some kind of momentum that felt both exciting and inevitable. When we reached Helen's house, she invited me in for coffee. Her father was asleep, and the house was quiet and peaceful. We sat on her couch again, but this time there was an electricity in the air that hadn't been there before. "Nathan," Helen said, setting down her coffee cup and turning to face me. "I need to tell you something." "Okay," I said. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said. "I know that might be too much too soon, but I've never been good at hiding how I feel." Her honesty took my breath away. I had been feeling the same thing, but had been afraid to say it first. "Helen," I said, reaching for her hands, "I've been falling in love with you since the day we met. I just didn't want to rush things and scare you away." You couldn't scare me away, she said, smiling. I'm tougher than I look. I leaned forward and kissed her then, finally crossing the line we had been dancing around for weeks. Her lips were soft and warm, and she tasted like coffee and something uniquely her. When we broke apart, she rested her forehead against mine. I've been wanting to do that for so long, she whispered. Me too, I said. We spent the rest of the evening talking and kissing, sharing the kind of intimate conversation that comes when two people finally admit their feelings for each other. Helen told me about her fears and dreams, and I shared mine. We talked about what we wanted from a relationship, what we had learned from past mistakes, what we hoped for in the future. When I finally left that night, we both knew that everything had changed between us. We were no longer just friends getting to know each other. We were two people who had found something rare and precious, and we were both committed to nurturing it carefully. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of my life. Helen and I fell into an easy rhythm of spending time together, supporting each other through daily challenges, and building the kind of partnership I had always hoped to find. She met my sister Frances, who immediately declared that Helen was perfect for me. I spent time with Helen's father on his good days, listening to his stories about pottery and learning about the techniques he had developed over decades of practice. Helen's father, Miguel, was a gentle man with weathered hands and kind eyes that reminded me of Helen's. On his clearer days, he would sit in his pottery studio and watch Helen work, offering quiet suggestions or simply enjoying the company. He seemed to approve of me, which meant more to Helen than I think she realized. One evening in late November, as Helen and I were cleaning up after dinner, Miguel appeared in the kitchen doorway looking confused. Mija, he said to Helen, who is this man in our house? Helen's face fell, and I could see the pain in her eyes. This is Nathan, Papa. Remember, he's my friend. Miguel studied me with suspicious eyes. I don't know any Nathan. Why is he here? He's here because I invited him, Papa, Helen said gently. He's a good man. You like him? I don't like strangers in my house, Miguel said, his voice rising slightly. Helen looked at me apologetically, and I could see tears forming in her eyes. It's okay, I mouthed to her. Mr. Cruz, I said, approaching Miguel slowly. I'm Nathan. I work with wood, like you work with clay. Would you like to see something I made? I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo of a wooden bowl I had turned on my lathe. Miguel's expression softened as he studied the image. This is good work, he said. The grain pattern is beautiful. Thank you, sir, I said. Helen tells me you're a master potter. I'd love to see some of your work sometime. Miguel smiled then, and for a moment his confusion seemed to clear. Helen makes beautiful pieces, he said. She learned from the best. He winked at Helen, who laughed despite her tears. Yes, Papa, she said. I learned from the best. Miguel wandered back to his room and Helen collapsed into a chair at the kitchen table. I'm sorry, Nathan, she said. The bad days are getting more frequent. You don't need to apologize, I said, sitting beside her. This is part of loving someone. The hard parts and the easy parts. She looked at me with such gratitude that it made my chest tight. How are you so understanding about everything? Because I care about you, I said. All of you. Your whole life, including the difficult parts. That night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Helen curled up against my side and said, I love you, Nathan Smith. I love you too, Helen Cruz, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. As winter settled over our small town, Helen and I grew closer and more committed to each other. We talked about the future carefully, acknowledging that her father's condition would likely continue to deteriorate and that our relationship would need to be strong enough to weather those challenges. One snowy December evening, I was working late in my garage workshop when Helen texted me. Are you still up? I have something to show you. Always up for you, I texted back. Come over. 20 minutes later, Helen arrived carrying a carefully wrapped package. She was bundled up in a heavy coat and wool hat, her cheeks pink from the cold. I made you something, she said, handing me the package. Inside was the most beautiful ceramic mug I had ever seen. It was a deep blue color with subtle variations in the glaze, and it fit perfectly in my hands. Helen, this is incredible, I said. You made this for me. I wanted you to have something I created, she said. Something that was made just for you. I set the mug down carefully and pulled her into my arms. Thank you, I said. It's perfect. There's something else, she said, reaching into her coat pocket. She pulled out a small wrapped box. Inside was the silver bracelet with the turquoise stone that she had admired at the arts festival. Nathan, she said, staring at the bracelet, how did you— I went back and bought it while you were looking at pottery, I said. I've been waiting for the right moment to give it to you. She started crying then, happy tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand. No one has ever paid attention to me the way you do, she said. I helped her put on the bracelet, and she held up her wrist to admire it. It's beautiful, Nathan. Thank you. We spent that evening in my workshop where I showed her some of the projects I was working on. Helen was fascinated by the process of woodworking, asking questions about different types of wood and tools. I loved watching her examine my work with the same careful attention she brought to pottery. As we stood there surrounded by the smell of sawdust and wood stain, Helen said, I have something else to tell you. What is it? I asked. I've been thinking about what I want to do with my life, she said. About my career, my future. And what have you decided? I asked. I want to stay here, she said. Not just because of my father, but because I love this town. I love the pace of life, the community, the way people know each other. And I love what we're building together. I felt a rush of relief and joy. I had been hoping she would want to stay, but hadn't wanted to influence her decision. What about your design career? I asked. I think I can build something here, she said. Maybe start my own pottery studio, teach classes, sell my work online. I've been talking to the community center about expanding their arts programs. That sounds perfect, I said. You'd be amazing at that. There's one more thing, she said, stepping closer to me. I want to do it with you, not just the business part, but all of it. I want to build a life here, with you. My heart felt like it might burst. Helen, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you, Nathan Smith, and I want to see what our future looks like together, she said. I kissed her then, right there in my workshop, surrounded by wood shavings and half-finished projects, and I knew that this was the moment my real life was finally beginning. That was 3 months ago, 3 months of growing closer, of learning to navigate the challenges of Miguel's illness together, of planning a future that felt both exciting and secure. Helen did start her own pottery studio, renting a small space downtown that she transformed into a beautiful workshop and gallery. I helped her build custom shelving and display cases, and watching her create that space was one of the most satisfying projects I had ever been part of. We moved in together 2 weeks ago, Helen and Miguel both moving into my house, which had more space for Miguel's needs. The transition has been easier than I expected, partly because Miguel seems more comfortable in a new environment, and partly because Helen and I work well as a team. Which brings me to tonight, to this moment in the hallway of the Riverside Community Center, where everything started. We had come here for a pottery show featuring work by Helen's students, and it had been a wonderful evening. Helen was glowing with pride as people admired the pieces her students had created, and I felt proud just watching her. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Helen was saying goodbye to her students and cleaning up the display. I offered to help, but she insisted she wanted to handle it herself, to savor the success of the evening. I'll meet you at home, I said, kissing her cheek. Take your time. I was walking down the hallway toward the exit when I felt her fingers catch my belt loop. Not so fast, she whispered. I turned around to find Helen standing there with a smile that made my knees weak. The hallway was empty now, just the two of us under the fluorescent lights that had witnessed the beginning of our story. What's wrong? I asked, though nothing seemed wrong at all. Nothing's wrong, she said, stepping closer. Everything's right. I just wanted to tell you something. What is it? I asked. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. Nathan Smith, she said, her voice slightly shaky but determined. I know this isn't traditional, but nothing about us has been traditional. I love you, and I love the life we're building together, and I want to make it official. Helen, I said, staring at the box in her hands. Will you marry me, Nathan? She asked. For a moment, I couldn't speak. This woman who had grabbed my belt loop and changed my entire world was asking me to marry her in the same hallway where we had first met. Yes, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, absolutely yes. She opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, and with shaking hands, she slipped it onto my finger. I love you, Helen Cruz, I said, pulling her into my arms. I love you too, Nathan Smith, she said. As we kissed there in the hallway, I thought about all the moments that had led us to this one. The chance meeting, the coffee dates, the long conversations, the gradual building of trust and love. I thought about how sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them, when you're just trying to get through another ordinary day. We're getting married in the spring in the small garden behind the community arts center. Miguel will walk Helen down the aisle on one of his good days, and Frances will stand beside me as my best woman. Helen's pottery students are making special pieces for the reception, and I'm building an arbor for the ceremony. But right now, in this moment, all that matters is that Helen Cruz grabbed my belt loop and changed everything. Sometimes love finds you in the most unexpected places, and sometimes the person you're meant to be with is standing right there in a hallway covered in clay dust, asking you not to walk away so fast. Sometimes the best stories begin with the simplest words. Not so fast. 3 words that turned my ordinary Tuesday evening into the beginning of the rest of my life.